The first time Callum Vale looked at me like a wife was the night he almost lost me to a man who worked on a ferry. But before that I was just paperwork. Just a signature beside his on a document that smelled like printer ink and cold coffee. I still remember the sound the heater made inside the lawyer office that afternoon. A weak clicking noise. Like it was trying very hard not to die. Outside, Baltimore was covered in freezing rain. Cargo ships groaned somewhere near the harbor, and my shoes were still wet from running across 3 blocks because my car had stopped working again. Grady Holt slid the contract toward me without emotion. 24 pages. Temporary marriage agreement. Public appearances required. Separate finances. Confidentiality clauses. I stared at the final number printed at the bottom of the page and felt my throat tighten. It was enough money to keep Mercer Family Pharmacy open another year. Enough to stop the bank from taking the building my mother spent 30 years inside before cancer buried her under medical debt we never escaped. I should have felt relieved. Instead I felt tired. The kind of tired that sits behind your ribs and follows you home. Callum sat across from me in silence, broad shoulders still damp from the weather. Dark wool coat. Rough hands. A face that looked carved out of exhaustion instead of arrogance. He did not look like the men people whispered about near the docks. He looked worse. Real. Grady cleared his throat softly. Miss Mercer, if you agree to the terms, Mr. Vale will transfer the first payment tonight. I looked at Callum. Why me? His eyes lifted slowly. Gray. Quiet. Dangerous in the way cold ocean water is dangerous. Because nobody would question it, he said. You keep your head down. You do not talk to reporters. You do not post your life online. You already live like somebody hiding. The words should have offended me. Instead, they landed too close to the truth. I signed anyway. The pen shook slightly in my hand. Maybe because I had not slept more than 4 hours in days. Maybe because part of me understood that people like Callum Vale did not enter your life without taking something with them. That night, he drove me back to my apartment near Eastern Avenue. No driver. No luxury convoy. Just an old black truck that smelled faintly like cedar and engine oil. We barely spoke during the 20-minute drive. Rain streaked across the windshield while harbor lights flickered against the glass like ghosts underwater. When we parked, I reached for the door handle, but Callum finally spoke. This changes paperwork, he said flatly. Not my life. I laughed once under my breath because it hurt less than reacting honestly. Trust me, I said. You are not exactly my dream husband either. For a second I thought I saw something shift in his expression. Not anger. Something more tired than that. I climbed the apartment stairs alone, my knees aching from another 14-hour shift at the pharmacy. The hallway smelled like boiled cabbage and old carpet. Inside my apartment the kitchen light was dead again. I muttered a curse softly and leaned my forehead against the wall. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy. Steady. Callum stood in the doorway holding a small toolbox. Where is the ladder? He asked. I blinked at him. What? The light bulb. I stared while rainwater still dripped from the edge of his coat onto my floor. This man had just reduced our marriage to a business arrangement 5 minutes earlier. Yet there he was at 10:30 at night changing the burnt kitchen bulb like it mattered. Neither of us spoke while he worked. The apartment stayed quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant horn of a cargo ship somewhere beyond the harbor. When the light finally flickered back on, warm gold spread across the cracked linoleum floor. Callum stepped down carefully, packed the toolbox and moved toward the door again. Good night, Naomi. It was the first time he said my name all day. And somehow that hurt more than if he had never said it at all. Marriage to Callum Vale turned out to be stranger than loneliness because loneliness at least explained itself. This did not. Some mornings I woke up to find grocery bags outside my apartment door without a message attached. Milk, bread, coffee filters, the exact migraine medicine I only bought when the pain got bad enough to blur my vision during night shifts. Other times he disappeared for 3 days straight without a single text. It was like being married to weather. You noticed him most when he was gone. 2 weeks after the wedding, my landlord stopped banging on my door about late rent. The bank suddenly paused foreclosure threats against the pharmacy. Even the broken radiator inside the back storage room got replaced while I was working a double shift. Nobody admitted who paid for it. Nobody had to. Meanwhile, I still barely saw my husband. Most nights, I came home around 1 in the morning smelling like antiseptic and cheap coffee while the harbor wind pushed freezing air through the old apartment windows. Sometimes I found Callum asleep on the couch for an hour or two before disappearing again before sunrise. He never turned the television on, never loosened his boots fully. Like some part of him did not believe he was allowed to stay anywhere comfortable. One Thursday night, I walked into the kitchen and found him sitting alone at the table under the weak yellow ceiling light, reading shipping manifests with a pencil. Not a laptop, not a tablet. Pencil marks. Smudged paper. You know computers exist, right? I asked while dropping my pharmacy bag onto the counter. Computers get hacked, he said without looking up. Paper burns. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the leftover Chinese takeout he must have bought because my fridge had been nearly empty that morning. That is somehow more disturbing. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not a smile exactly. More like he almost remembered how. I realized then that Callum did not talk like other men. Most people filled silence because they feared it. He lived inside silence like it was safer there. I heated noodles in the microwave while he continued reading. The apartment hummed quietly around us. Pipes knocking in the walls. A siren somewhere downtown. Rain tapping against the fire escape outside the kitchen window. Your brother still working at the garage? He asked suddenly. I looked over in surprise. You remember Owen? You mention him every day. That caught me off guard, because I had not noticed myself doing that. I leaned against the counter carefully. He is trying to save enough money to open his own place eventually. Callum nodded once. Good trade. You sound impressed. Mechanics can fix things people actually need. There was something oddly sad about the way he said it. Before I could answer, his phone vibrated against the table. He checked the screen once, and the entire mood inside the apartment changed. Not dramatic. Worse. Controlled. He stood immediately, sliding papers back into a folder. I have to go. At midnight. That is usually when bad news shows up. He grabbed his coat, but before reaching the door he stopped. There is cash inside the blue envelope near the sink. My stomach tightened instantly. I am not taking your money every week. It is not charity. Then what is it? He finally looked at me fully. Tired gray eyes. Storm-colored. A husband paying bills. The words should have sounded comforting. Instead, they landed heavy between us because that was exactly the problem. Bills. Repairs. Rent. He knew how to keep me alive. But standing there in that tiny kitchen with cold noodles in my hands, I realized Callum Vale still had no idea how to actually be married to someone. Then he left again, and 30 seconds later I heard his truck disappear into the wet Baltimore night, while the microwave kept spinning behind me long after the food was already warm. The first time I saw fear in Callum Vale, he was wearing a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent and standing under ballroom chandeliers that made him look even more out of place. The charity event was held at an old maritime museum downtown. Rich donors, harbor officials, politicians pretending they cared about working people while waiters carried tiny crab cakes across polished floors. I almost did not recognize Callum when he walked into the room beside me because I had only ever seen him in dark coats smelling like rain and engine oil. But even dressed like that, he still carried himself like a man expecting trouble. His hand rested lightly against the center of my back as cameras flashed near the entrance. Not affectionate, directional. Smile, he said quietly without moving his mouth. You sound thrilled to be here. I would rather get hit by a bus. I almost laughed, but then I noticed how tense his jaw looked. You okay? No, the honesty surprised me enough to glance at him. You could have lied. Too tired tonight. That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. Inside the ballroom, people approached us constantly. Men shaking Callum's hand too firmly. Women studying me with polite curiosity. Everybody seemed careful around him without openly admitting why. Like standing too close to fire while pretending not to notice the heat. I played the role exactly how the contract required. Smile. Nod. Stand beside him. Pretend this marriage existed outside paperwork. But somewhere between speeches and overpriced wine, I started noticing things Callum did not realize he was doing. He never drank more than half a glass. Never turned his back fully toward crowded rooms. Every 15 minutes, his eyes flicked toward exits automatically. Survival instincts, not confidence. Near the end of the night, a silver-haired man approached us near the harbor exhibit. Senator Whitmore. I recognized him from local television. Mr. Vale, the senator said smoothly. Your shipping company seems to be expanding fast lately. Callum's expression stayed neutral. Business has been good. I imagine federal inspectors might become interested in that. The temperature between them changed instantly. Invisible. Sharp. I felt it anyway. The senator smiled at me next. And you must be the new wife. Like I was another item purchased recently. Before I could answer, Callum stepped slightly closer to my side. Small movement. Protective. Naomi works harder than anybody in this room, he said coldly. That includes me. The senator looked amused. You sound proud. I am. The word hit me unexpectedly hard because it came without hesitation. Not romance. Not performance. Just truth. The senator eventually drifted away, but Callum stayed still beside me afterward, staring toward the harbor windows where cargo cranes blinked red against the black water outside. You hate events like this, I said softly. I hate rooms where everybody smiles before stabbing each other. Comforting. His eyes finally shifted toward me. You should leave early. Why? Because I might not stay polite much longer. I studied him carefully then. The tension in his shoulders. The exhaustion under his eyes. The way his fingers flexed once near his side like he was resisting the urge to break something simply to release pressure. And suddenly I understood something important about Callum Vale. He was not emotionally distant because he felt nothing. He was emotionally distant because feeling too much looked dangerous on him. On the drive home, rain hammered the truck hard enough to blur the streets outside. Neither of us spoke for several minutes until Callum reached into the inside pocket of his coat and handed me an envelope. What is this? I asked. Pharmacy tax records. I frowned. Why do you have those? Because the city plans to raise commercial rent on your block next quarter. My stomach tightened. How do you even know that? Because people talk around me when they think I am not listening. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were documents, highlighted numbers, handwritten notes in pencil, and the business card of a small accountant in Canton. Somebody who specialized in helping family businesses survive redevelopment. I looked over at him in disbelief. You did all this? His hand stayed steady on the wheel. You said your mother built that pharmacy from nothing. Rainwater rolled across the windshield in silver streaks while downtown lights reflected across his tired face. People should not lose things like that because rich investors get bored. And for the first time since signing the contract, something inside me shifted quietly against my will because that did not sound like a cold man. It sounded like a man trying very badly to hide where his heart still lived. 3 days later, the pharmacy almost lost power in the middle of a December cold snap. I was counting controlled medication inventory when every light above the aisles flickered hard enough to make customers look up nervously. The old refrigerator units in the back clicked twice. Then silence. My stomach dropped instantly because half the insulin stock would be ruined if the cooling system stayed off too long. Naomi, my coworker Tina called from behind the register. The card readers just died. Perfect. Outside, sleet hit the windows sideways while people in heavy coats crowded deeper into the store, frustrated and cold. The landlord had already delayed electrical maintenance twice that month because he wanted tenants out before redevelopment crews arrived in spring. Everybody knew it. Nobody could stop it. I grabbed my phone and called the emergency utility line while trying not to panic. 40 minutes minimum. Maybe longer because of weather conditions. I closed my eyes briefly. 40 minutes could destroy thousands of dollars in medication we could not afford to replace. Then my phone buzzed with another call. Callum. I almost ignored it out of stress alone. What? I answered too sharply. You sound cheerful. The pharmacy lost power. Silence. Not empty silence. Processing silence. How long? No idea. Stay there. The line disconnected before I could answer. Typical. 25 minutes later, headlights cut through the sleet outside the front windows. Not one truck. 3. Men in dark winter jackets unloaded portable generators while Callum walked straight through the pharmacy entrance carrying freezing air in with him. Customers actually moved aside without him saying a word. "Back room," he told the workers calmly. "Now." I stared at him in disbelief. "How did you even get industrial generators this fast? Cold storage warehouses use backups. You stole these." "Borrowed." That is not reassuring. For the next hour, the pharmacy turned into organized chaos. Extension cables, fuel containers, refrigeration alarms restarting. Tina openly stared at Callum like she was watching a crime documentary come to life while he crouched beside the dead breaker panel with rolled sleeves and grease on his knuckles. And somehow, absurdly, he looked more comfortable here than he did at charity galas. "Hold the flashlight steady," he muttered toward me. "I am holding it. You are pointing it at the ceiling. Because you are blocking everything." His mouth twitched faintly again. That almost smile. The one that appeared only when he forgot himself. Around midnight, power finally stabilized. Customers were gone. Tina had left. Snowy slush melted across the pharmacy floor near the entrance while the old heating vents rattled back to life overhead. I leaned against the counter, exhausted clear through my bones. "You did not have to come." Callum wiped his hands slowly with a shop towel. "Yes, I did." "Because of the contract?" He looked at me then. Really looked at me. "Because your face looked scared when you answered the phone." The words hit so directly that I forgot how to respond for a second. Callum glanced around the pharmacy afterward. Shelves packed too tightly. Old tile floors. Faded family photos near the consultation window. My mother smiling beside me at 16 in an oversized white coat. "You grew up here," he said quietly. "Mostly. That is why you fight so hard for it." I swallowed carefully. When my mother got sick, she kept apologizing for leaving us with debt. My voice sounded thinner than I wanted. Even in hospice, she still worried about bills. Callum stood very still listening. "Nobody should spend their last days apologizing for being sick," he said finally. There was anger in his voice then. Not loud anger. Worse. The controlled kind that settles deep. Snow tapped softly against the front windows while the pharmacy hummed around us in tired fluorescent light. For the first time since marrying him, I realized something dangerous. Callum Vale did not only protect things because he was powerful. He protected things because once upon a time, nobody protected his family at all. Then his phone buzzed again. He checked the screen once, and the warmth disappeared from his expression instantly. "I have to leave. Everything okay?" He slid the phone back into his coat. "No." "Can you tell me what is happening?" His eyes met mine across the dim pharmacy. Tired. Guarded. Alone in a way I suddenly understood too well. "The less you know," he said quietly, "the safer you stay." Then he walked back out into the snow while generator engines rumbled outside like distant thunder. And for the first time since this marriage began, I hated the fact that I watched him leave instead of asking him to stay. The rumors started 2 weeks before Christmas. Not loud at first. Just little things. Customers lowering their voices when I walked past the cold medicine aisle. Delivery drivers going quiet when they saw my wedding ring. One woman from the neighborhood actually grabbed my wrist near the register and whispered, "You should be careful around men like that." Like I had accidentally married a storm nobody else could survive. By then, federal agents had already started showing up near the docks more often. Black SUVs parked outside shipping offices. Men in navy jackets eating bad sandwiches inside unmarked cars while pretending not to watch people. Baltimore was small enough that tension traveled faster than facts. And somehow, my pharmacy became part of the conversation. One Tuesday afternoon, I arrived at work to find an official inspection notice taped to the front door. Surprise audit. Controlled substances review. Tina looked pale behind the counter. We have never been audited this close to Christmas before. Neither had I. Customers waited awkwardly while 2 inspectors moved through the pharmacy with clipboards and sealed evidence bags. Nothing illegal happened. We followed regulations carefully, but that did not matter. Audits scared people, especially older customers already nervous about prescriptions and insurance. By evening, 3 regulars transferred their medication to a chain pharmacy across town. I tried not to panic while reorganizing paperwork for the inspectors, But my hands kept trembling slightly every time another customer avoided eye contact with me. Around 6, Owen stormed into the consultation room smelling like motor oil and winter air. Tell me this is not because of him. I shut the cabinet harder than necessary. Lower your voice. Naomi. I said lower your voice. He stared at me for a second before dragging both hands through his hair in frustration. People are talking about your husband like he runs half the docks. People talk about everybody. Federal agents do not follow everybody. That landed harder. Because part of me had been thinking the same thing for days. Owen leaned against the counter afterward, exhaustion replacing anger. I just do not want you caught in something dangerous because you think you owe somebody. I looked down at the prescription labels spread across the table between us. I know exactly what this marriage is. But even saying it, I no longer sounded convincing to myself. That night, after closing the pharmacy, I found Callum waiting outside beside his truck. Not leaning casually. Standing completely still with both hands inside his coat pockets while harbor wind pushed cold air through the empty street. How bad was it? He asked immediately. So he already knew. Of course he did. 3 customers transferred out. That will stop. You do not know that. Yes, I do. I crossed my arms tightly against the cold. You cannot solve every problem by throwing influence at it. I know. Do you? The words came out sharper than I intended. Callum stayed quiet. Streetlights painted pale gold across his tired face while traffic hissed somewhere beyond the block. You said this marriage would not change your life, I said finally. Now my business is getting audited because people are afraid of your world spilling into mine. Something flickered across his expression then. Not anger. Guilt. Real guilt. I tried to keep distance between those things. Well, you failed. Silence stretched between us while a city bus groaned past the intersection nearby. I immediately regretted saying it because Callum looked like a man already carrying too much weight to stand upright comfortably. But instead of defending himself, he reached into his coat slowly and handed me a folded document. What is this? Property transfer proposal. I frowned and opened it under the streetlight. The abandoned laundromat next door to the pharmacy. The owner wants to sell before redevelopment taxes hit. I looked up at him in confusion. Why are you showing me this? Because if you expand into the empty building, you can add clinical services. His voice stayed calm and practical. Vaccinations. Basic screenings. More insurance contracts. It could stabilize revenue. Long term. I stared at the papers in my hands while cold wind pushed loose strands of hair across my face. Most people looked at my pharmacy and saw a dying neighborhood business. Callum looked at it like something worth saving permanently. Why do you care so much? I asked quietly. He looked past me toward the glowing pharmacy sign my mother once paid for in cash 20 years earlier. Because nobody fought for my father's business when it started collapsing, he said. Everybody just watched it drown. Then he opened the truck door for me without another word. And for the first time I realized the most dangerous thing about Callum Vale was not what people whispered he did at the harbor. It was how impossible he was becoming to hate. By January the marriage stopped feeling fake in ways that made me nervous. Not romantic. Worse. Familiar. Callum started leaving his boots beside the apartment door instead of keeping them on like he expected to leave any second. He memorized which nights I worked late without asking. Sometimes I came home and found soup warming quietly on the stove in a dented saucepan that definitely did not belong to him. He still barely talked about himself, but little pieces slipped through accidentally. He hated cinnamon because his father drank whiskey that smelled like it. He could not sleep without some kind of background noise because silence reminded him of being a kid waiting for bad news. He always checked locks twice before bed. Not because he was paranoid. Because once upon a time nobody locked doors for him. And somehow, against my better judgment, I started waiting for the sound of his truck outside at night. That scared me more than the federal agents. One Sunday afternoon, Owen convinced me to take a break and ride the ferry across the harbor with him after his shift ended early. You look half dead, he said while stealing fries off my plate at the diner near the terminal. That is because I work 80 hours a week. And because your husband looks like a man carrying classified secrets in his bloodstream. I kicked his boot under the table. Be nice. Owen stared at me immediately. Oh no. What? You are defending him. Now. I am not. Naomi. I looked away first because that usually meant he was right. The ferry terminal was crowded with Ravens fans, exhausted dock workers, and tourists wearing scarves too thin for Baltimore winter. The harbor air smelled like salt and diesel fuel while gulls screamed overhead. Owen got called back to the garage before boarding, leaving me alone near the loading ramp holding 2 paper tickets and an untouched pretzel. You look like somebody canceled Christmas, a voice beside me said. I turned and found a tall man in a dark rescue department jacket smiling slightly. Early 30s maybe. Wind-reddened cheeks. Calm eyes. My brother abandoned me for carburetors, I answered. Tragic. He pointed toward the extra ticket in my hand. Mind if I help prevent financial waste? I should have said no. But something about him felt easy. Normal.
Fine, he sighed dramatically.
But if you murder me halfway across the harbor, I am going to be very annoyed. He laughed once while we boarded. His name was Miles Arden. Ferry rescue crew. Grew up in Dundalk. Divorced parents. A dog named Murphy that apparently ate drywall when anxious. The conversation stayed harmless and strangely comfortable while gray water rolled beneath the ferry deck.
No tensión.
No flirting games. Just 2 tired adults talking like people who had survived enough life to stop pretending all the time. Halfway through the ride, my phone buzzed. Callum. I stared at the screen too long. Everything okay? Miles asked casually. Yeah. But I still declined the call. Not because I was angry. Because suddenly I did not know what Callum and I were becoming, and that uncertainty exhausted me. A few minutes later, dizziness hit hard enough that I grabbed the cold metal railing beside me. I had skipped breakfast and barely slept after 3 overnight shifts in a row. Whoa, Miles said immediately, catching my elbow before my knees fully gave out. Easy. Embarrassment burned through me instantly. I am fine. You are pale as hell. That is just my face. He laughed softly despite concern still written across his expression. Sit down before you fall into the harbor. He guided me carefully toward a bench near the cabin entrance, still holding my hand briefly to steady me while the ferry rocked against rough winter water. And that was the exact moment I looked up and saw Callum standing on the dock across the terminal. Motionless. One hand still wrapped around his ringing phone. The distance between us could not have been more than 30 feet, but the expression on his face made it feel like the harbor had split open underneath him. Not rage. Not jealousy. Something quieter. More dangerous. Like a man realizing too late that somebody else had learned how to catch his wife before he ever did. Callum did not call me again that night. That somehow felt worse. No angry messages.
No accusations.
Just silence. The heavy kind. The kind that settles into your apartment before you even walk through the door. When I got home after the ferry ride, his truck was already parked outside beneath the flickering street lamp. I stood there for a second holding my pharmacy bag against my chest while cold wind pushed through the alley between buildings. Part of me considered walking another block just to delay whatever waited upstairs. But avoidance had never actually saved me from anything. Inside the apartment, the kitchen light was on. Callum sat at the table exactly where he usually reviewed shipping manifests, except tonight there were no papers in front of him. Just an untouched plate of food gone cold beside his elbow. He looked up once when I entered.
No visible anger.
Somehow that made my stomach tighten harder. You did not answer your phone, he said quietly. I set my keys down carefully. I was on the ferry. I noticed. There it was. Not jealousy. Hurt disguised as restraint. I took off my coat slowly. I almost fainted, Callum. Somebody helped me sit down. That is all. His jaw shifted once. I know. Then what exactly is the problem? He looked at the table instead of me. Nothing. I almost laughed out of disbelief. You have been sitting here in the dark for 2 hours saying nothing and somehow that is supposed to mean nothing? Silence again. But this time I recognized it for what it really was. Not punishment. Fear. Callum finally leaned back in the chair and rubbed one rough hand across his mouth like exhaustion physically hurt. You called somebody else. I blinked at him. What? Not tonight. His voice stayed low and steady. Last week during the inspection. Your radiator problem before that. Your migraines. He swallowed once before continuing. Every time something happens, you handle it alone until you physically cannot anymore. The words landed harder because they were true. That is not fair, I said quietly. No. He looked at me then, gray eyes sharp with something dangerously close to emotion. I pay attention, Naomi. You think I do not, but I do. I crossed my arms tightly. You pay bills. That is different. The second the sentence left my mouth, regret flashed through me because Callum went completely still. Like I had hit an old bruise directly. You think that is all I know how to do, he said. Not defensive. Certain. And suddenly I understood something painful. Somewhere along the way, Callum had convinced himself that usefulness was the same thing as love because usefulness was the only thing anybody ever kept him around for. I sat down slowly across from him. That is not what I meant. It is true though. His voice stayed calm, but calmer than usual in the way deep water looks calm before storms. My father lost everything because he stopped being useful to people. After that, nobody stayed. The apartment suddenly felt smaller around us. Pipes humming softly. The radiator clicking unevenly near the wall. I had never heard him mention his father this directly before. Callum. So yes, he interrupted quietly. I fix things. I pay for things. I solve problems before they reach you. His eyes finally lifted back to mine. Because I do not know what else makes somebody worth keeping. The honesty in that sentence cracked something open between us. Not romance. Something rawer than that. I looked down at my hands because suddenly my chest hurt in a way I could not explain. The guy tonight, Callum said after a long pause. Does he know you skip meals when you work overnight shifts? I frowned slightly. What? Because he caught you before I ever did. There was no accusation in his voice anymore. Only shame. Quiet, devastating shame. And somehow that felt infinitely worse than anger could have. I leaned back slowly in my chair, exhausted all at once. You know what the stupid part is? I said softly. I did not even realize you noticed things like that. Callum stared at me for several seconds before answering. I notice everything about you. The apartment fell silent again afterward, but this time it was different. Not empty. Not cold. Just two damaged people sitting across from each other under weak kitchen light, finally admitting that this marriage had stopped being simple a long time ago. The fight started over a cardboard box. Not another man. Not jealousy. Just a worn-out box sitting beside our apartment door on a Thursday night while my feet ached so badly I could barely climb the stairs. I almost stepped over it before noticing my mother's handwriting across the top in faded black marker. Pharmacy storage. My stomach tightened immediately because I had not seen that box since the hospital cleared out her belongings after she died. I dragged it inside slowly, confusion already crawling under my skin. Callum was standing at the kitchen sink rolling his sleeves down after washing dishes when he saw it. And for the first time since I met him, he actually looked caught off guard. Where did this come from? I asked carefully. He dried his hands once before answering. Storage auction in Essex. My chest tightened harder. You bought my mother's storage unit? Silence. That was answer enough. I stared at him in disbelief. Callum. The facility planned to dispose of it next week. That is not the point. My voice rose before I could stop it. Why would you even do that? He frowned slightly like the answer was obvious. Because it belonged to your family. Without asking me? He looked genuinely confused by my reaction. I thought you would want it back. I laughed once sharply, more overwhelmed than angry. You cannot just quietly buy pieces of my life every time something hurts me. His shoulders stiffened immediately. I was trying to help. I know. My eyes burned unexpectedly as I looked at the box again. That is what makes this so exhausting. The apartment fell silent except for traffic outside and the uneven hum of the old refrigerator. Callum stood across from me looking like a man who had walked into a trap without understanding where the wire snapped. Naomi, do you know what it feels like sometimes? I interrupted softly. To wake up and realize every problem around me has already been solved before I even speak? He stared at me carefully now. Guarded. That sounds terrible when you say it like that. Because it is not normal. I swallowed hard. You pay debts nobody asked you to pay. You buy buildings. You fix things before I decide whether I even want them fixed. My voice cracks slightly despite trying to control it. You make decisions about my life, like you are protecting something fragile. Something cold moved through his expression then. Not anger. Defensiveness. You think I am controlling you. I think you do not know the difference between helping someone and managing them. That hit. I saw it immediately in the way his jaw locked tight. You were drowning when I met you. And now I cannot tell which parts of my life still belong to me. The words landed between us like broken glass. Callum looked away first, which somehow hurt more than if he had shouted. You think I am trying to own you. His voice had gone very quiet now. Dangerous only because of how deeply restrained it sounded. No, I said instantly. I think you are terrified people will leave if you stop being useful. That finally made him look back at me. Completely still. Like I had just spoken a truth nobody was supposed to touch. For several seconds neither of us moved. Then Callum nodded once slowly. Maybe. The honesty knocked the anger out of me immediately. He rubbed one hand over the back of his neck afterward, exhausted in a way I had never seen before. When my father lost his shipping contract, he said quietly, people stopped answering his calls within a month. I stayed silent. My mother left 6 weeks later. His eyes drifted toward the apartment window without really seeing it. After that, I learned very quickly that people stay close to whoever solves problems. Something inside my chest twisted painfully, because suddenly this was not about money or control anymore. It was about a boy who watched his family disappear piece by piece and decided usefulness was safer than vulnerability. I stepped closer carefully. Callum. But you are right. He cut me off softly. I do not know how to do this halfway. His voice roughened slightly for the first time. If I care about somebody, I start trying to hold the world together around them before it falls apart. The fight should have ended there. Instead, it got worse because tears suddenly burned behind my eyes out of pure exhaustion. I do not need you to hold the whole world together, I whispered. I just need you to stand beside me while it shakes. Callum looked at me then with an expression so raw it almost frightened me because for the first time since this marriage began, I realized he genuinely did not know how. Things did not magically become better after that night. If anything, everything became more uncomfortable because now the truth sat openly between us every time we entered the same room. Callum stopped trying to quietly solve problems without asking me first, but the absence of those habits felt strange too. Like somebody had removed a wall I secretly leaned against. 3 days after the fight, the pharmacy freezer started making a grinding noise again. Normally Callum would have replaced the entire unit before sunrise. This time he just handed me the number of a repair technician and asked, "Do you want help paying for it? Or do you want to handle it yourself?" The question should have felt respectful. Instead, I almost snapped at him from pure emotional whiplash. "You are asking permission to breathe now?" He looked down briefly before answering, "I am trying not to make you feel trapped." That shut me up immediately because I could hear how careful he was becoming around me. Careful in the way injured people become careful after touching a hot stove. Meanwhile, outside our apartment, his world kept getting uglier. Federal investigations spread across the harbor faster than anyone expected. One shipping supervisor disappeared overnight. Another accepted immunity deals according to local news. Every conversation inside Baltimore suddenly carried the same nervous undercurrent. People sensed something collapsing. At the pharmacy, customers stared at my wedding ring more openly now. One older woman even asked if I was safe at home, while picking up blood pressure medication. I smiled politely until she left, then locked myself in the storage room and cried for exactly 90 seconds out of sheer humiliation and exhaustion before returning to work. That night, I found Callum sitting alone at the small kitchen table with reading glasses on for the first time since I met him. The sight startled me enough to stop walking. He looked up immediately and removed them like he had been caught doing something embarrassing. "You wear glasses?" I asked before thinking. "For paperwork. That is somehow the least intimidating thing I have ever seen." A faint tired smile touched his mouth, then disappeared again almost instantly. There were dark circles under his eyes now that no amount of silence could hide anymore. He looked like somebody sleeping inside stress instead of beds. I opened the refrigerator slowly. "A customer asked if I was safe around you today." His expression changed immediately. Not angry. Hello. What did you say? That you leave dishes in the sink and forget laundry in the dryer like every other man over 30. He stared at me for a second before a quiet laugh escaped him unexpectedly. Real this time. Low and rough and gone too quickly. The sound caught me off guard because I realized I had never actually heard him laugh before. Then his phone buzzed on the table. One glance at the screen erased every trace of warmth from his face. I have to go. Again. The exhaustion slipped into my voice before I could hide it. Callum stood slowly, reaching for his coat. Container inspections at the docks. At 11:30 at night? That is when federal agents like surprising people. I crossed my arms tightly. You keep saying you want me safe, but you still will not tell me what is actually happening. He paused near the doorway without turning fully toward me. Because once you know certain things, you cannot unknow them. Callum. Naomi. His voice stayed calm but strained underneath. Please do not ask me to choose between honesty and keeping you out of this. That answer followed me long after he left. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of somebody knocking hard downstairs in the street. Not our apartment door. Outside. Angry male voices echoed through the alley while headlights flashed across the bedroom ceiling. I moved toward the window carefully and froze when I saw 2 federal vehicles parked near Callum's truck. Men in jackets questioning somebody near the curb. My stomach dropped instantly. Callum was standing under the streetlight answering questions with both hands visible in his coat pockets, while snow drifted quietly through the yellow glow above him. He looked calm from this distance. Too calm. Like a man already used to surviving situations that could ruin him. One agent handed him paperwork before the vehicles finally pulled away. Callum stayed standing there alone for several seconds afterward without moving. Then slowly, almost wearily, he leaned one hand against the side of his truck and lowered his head. Not dramatic. Just tired. Devastatingly tired. And upstairs behind the apartment window, I realized something terrifying. I was no longer afraid of the world around Callum Vale. I was afraid of what would happen to him if that world finally swallowed him whole. The next morning, Callum was already gone when I woke up, but for the first time in months, he had left a handwritten note beside the stove instead of silently disappearing. Eggs in fridge. Eat before work. The handwriting looked rough and uneven, like somebody who rarely wrote personal things by hand anymore. Underneath, there was also a small white paper bag from the pharmacy supply warehouse across town. Inside were compression socks for long shifts, and a new wrist brace because he had noticed me rubbing my hand after counting pills too many hours every night. No dramatic message. No flowers. Just practical things that meant he had been paying attention. I sat there at the kitchen table staring at that stupid wrist brace for almost 5 full minutes before finally laughing once under my breath because somehow this emotionally damaged man had learned how to care for people the same way exhausted nurses did. Quietly. Through survival. At work later that afternoon, the pharmacy stayed unusually slow because another winter storm warning kept most people home. I was reorganizing inventory when Owen walked in carrying a cardboard tray of grilled cheese sandwiches from the diner near his garage. Peace offering, he announced. You look like a hostage negotiator failed. I smiled tiredly while taking one. Romantic. How is Mr. Shipping manifest? I rolled my eyes automatically, but before answering, I noticed movement outside the front window. Callum's truck pulling into the curb. Speak of the emotionally unavailable devil, Owen muttered. Usually, Callum never came inside during daytime hours unless something was wrong. But this time he walked through the pharmacy carrying 2 large plastic storage bins instead. What is that? I asked immediately. Your expansion project. I blinked. My what? He set the bins carefully on the consultation counter. Inside were old architectural drawings, permit applications, zoning maps, and handwritten renovation estimates for the abandoned laundromat next door. Not completed plans. Research. Organized into folders with sticky notes marking sections I should review myself. You did all this? Callum shrugged out of his coat slowly. You said you wanted choices. I stared down at the paperwork in disbelief. He had not bought the property secretly this time. Had not solved the problem for me. He had simply gathered information and handed the decision back where it belonged. Owen looked between both of us like witnessing a rare weather event. Okay, he said carefully. That is actually weirdly healthy. Callum ignored him completely. The owner will wait another 30 days before listing publicly. He pointed toward one folder. There is a grant program for neighborhood healthcare expansion. Application deadline is February. You researched grants? I asked. I know accountants. That is not the surprising part. Something shifted quietly in Callum's expression then. Not pride. Exactly. Relief maybe. Like somebody realizing they finally did one thing correctly after years of guessing wrong. Later that evening after Owen left, the pharmacy got busy again with people picking up storm prescriptions before roads iced overnight. Around 8, the front door opened and Miles Arden stepped inside wearing his ferry department jacket and carrying a prescription pickup slip. The timing felt almost cosmically cruel. Hey, he said warmly after spotting me. You still conscious? Debatable. He laughed softly while leaning against the counter. My captain says I need antibiotics before I infect half the harbor. Then he noticed Callum near the consultation desk organizing permit folders into neat stacks. The atmosphere changed immediately. Not aggressive, just aware. Miles straightened slightly. Callum went completely still. Callum, I said carefully, this is Miles. Ferry rescue. The two men shook hands once. Firm. Brief. Miles smiled politely. Your wife almost passed out on my ferry last week. The second he said your wife, something moved across Callum's face too fast to fully hide. Not ownership. Recognition. Like hearing the reality of us spoken aloud by another person hit differently somehow. I heard, Callum replied evenly. Miles glanced between us afterward, perceptive enough to notice tension neither of us voiced. Well, he said lightly while pocketing the prescription bag. Take care of yourself, Naomi. You too. After he left, silence settled across the pharmacy for several seconds, while snow tapped against the windows outside. Then Callum quietly picked up the empty sandwich wrapper I had forgotten beside the register and threw it away without being asked. Small action. Ordinary. But something about it undid me a little because months ago, this man only knew how to protect me from disasters. Now he was learning how to stand inside ordinary life with me too. Healing, I learned, was not soft music and dramatic speeches. It was arguing over utility bills at midnight because both people were too stubborn to admit they were scared. It was Callum standing awkwardly in the pharmacy aisle holding cough syrup while trying to remember which brand Owen usually bought. It was me waking up in the middle of the night reaching toward the other side of the bed before realizing he still was not used to sleeping beside somebody consistently enough to stay there until morning. We kept missing each other emotionally by inches, but somehow we kept trying anyway. One Saturday afternoon, Callum helped me clear out the abandoned laundromat next door to the pharmacy so I could start planning renovations. The building smelled like dust, old detergent, and rusted pipes. Half the fluorescent ceiling lights were dead, and somebody had left broken plastic hangers scattered across the cracked tile floor years ago. Owen worked on removing old machines in the back, while I sorted paperwork near the front windows. Callum arrived late carrying takeout containers and wearing an old gray sweatshirt instead of his usual dark coat. The casualness of it startled me more than expensive suits ever had. You ate? He asked immediately. I had pretzels. His expression flattened. Pretzels are not a meal. That sounds judgmental coming from a man who considers beef jerky nutritional. Owen snorted loudly from the back room. For a while things almost felt normal. Not fantasy perfect. Real normal. Callum held ladders steady while I labeled shelving measurements. He listened quietly while Owen complained about rising parts prices at the garage. At one point I looked up and found Callum studying the sunlight hitting dust particles near the front window like he had forgotten people could build things instead of just surviving them. Then his phone rang. Everything changed immediately. He stepped outside to answer, but through the glass storefront I watched tension lock through his shoulders almost instantly. His jaw tightened. One hand pressed against his hip while he listened silently for nearly a full minute. When he came back inside, the warmth was gone again. I have to leave, he said. Owen muttered something under his breath while dragging another rusted machine across the floor. I wiped dust off my hands slowly. Can it wait 1 hour? No, you always say that. The frustration slipped out before I could stop it. Callum. looked exhausted instantly. Naomi. I am serious. I gestured around the half-renovated building. You show up for pieces of life now, which is good. But every single time something starts feeling stable, your phone rings and you disappear like the rest of us are temporary. Silence. Heavy silence. Owen wisely vanished into the storage room behind us. Callum rubbed one hand across his face slowly. I do not know how to explain this world to you without dragging you into it. Then stop acting like I am too fragile to hear the truth. His eyes lifted sharply toward mine. You think this is about fragility? The tone in his voice warned me immediately that I had stepped onto dangerous emotional ground. Then what is it about? For a second he looked like he might actually answer honestly. Then the wall returned. Immediate. Automatic. It is complicated. I laughed once bitterly. There it is. Naomi.
No, seriously.
Every time things get real between us, you hide behind that word like it solves something. He stared at me across the dusty laundromat floor, hurt flickering through his expression before hardening into restraint again. I am trying. I know you are trying. My voice cracked despite myself. But sometimes it feels like you are trying to protect me from having an actual relationship with you. That landed hard enough that he looked away first. For several seconds neither of us moved while winter light faded slowly through the storefront windows. Then Callum nodded once very slightly. Maybe I do not know how to let somebody stay once they see everything. The honesty softened me instantly, but not enough to erase the damage completely, because healing was not linear. Some wounds still reacted before logic could catch up. I stepped closer slowly and brushed dust off the sleeve of his sweatshirt without really thinking about it. Small touch. Careful. I am still here, I said quietly. Callum looked down at my hand like he did not fully trust it. And somehow that hurt more than any argument we had survived so far. 2 weeks later, Callum handed me divorce papers at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, while I was standing in the kitchen eating cereal. Straight from the box. For a second, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. What is this? I asked slowly. Callum stood near the doorway in his dark thermal Henley and work boots, looking like he had not slept at all. An exit, he said quietly. My stomach dropped hard enough to hurt. Excuse me. The federal investigation is getting worse. His voice stayed level, but I could hear strain underneath every word now. Lawyers think separating your name from mine before indictments start might protect the pharmacy. I stared at the folder in my hands without opening it. So your solution is divorce over breakfast? Naomi. No, seriously, should I pour orange juice first or after my husband legally abandons me? Pain flickered across his face instantly. Good. Mine hurt too. I am trying to keep your life intact. And I am getting really tired of you deciding what my life should look like. The apartment fell quiet except for the old radiator hissing unevenly beside the window. Callum looked exhausted standing there. Not cold. Not distant. Just worn down to the edges. If this investigation turns public, he said carefully, people around me are going to get dragged through things they do not deserve. So let me make my own choice. His jaw tightened slightly. You do not fully understand the risk. Then explain it. Silence. Again. Always that wall. He looked away first, toward the apartment window where dirty snow still lined the sidewalks outside. There are names connected to the harbor that should never touch your world. But you touch my world. That landed between us heavily. Because that was the truth neither of us knew how to solve anymore. I set the divorce papers down untouched on the counter. You know what the worst part is? I asked quietly. You still think loving somebody means leaving before they get hurt. Callum swallowed once. Sometimes it does. No, my voice shook now despite trying to steady it. Sometimes loving somebody means trusting them enough to stay and decide for themselves. For several long seconds he said nothing at all. Then finally, almost reluctantly, he nodded once. Okay. The answer surprised me. Enough to blink. Okay. You want a choice? His tired gray eyes lifted back toward mine. Then I will stop deciding for you. It sounded simple, but something enormous shifted underneath those words because for the first time since our marriage began, Callum was not trying to manage my future for me. He was standing there terrified and letting me remain anyway. Later that night, after my shift ended, I found him asleep on the couch with paperwork spread across his chest and reading glasses halfway down his nose again. The television played low static because he still could not sleep in complete silence. For a while I just stood there watching him breathe. This complicated, emotionally damaged man who still believed usefulness was safer than being loved directly. Then quietly, I picked up the blanket draped over the chair and covered him carefully without waking him. Callum stirred slightly anyway. "You are home," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Yeah." His hand moved instinctively, fingers brushing lightly against my wrist like he needed physical confirmation before fully relaxing again. Such a small thing. Barely conscious. But my chest tightened unexpectedly because there was no strategy in it. No control. Just trust. I sat down on the edge of the couch beside him while snowplows rumbled faintly somewhere downtown. "I have not signed the papers," I said softly. Callum stayed quiet for a moment before answering without opening his eyes. "I know. You really would let me walk away if I wanted to." This time he opened his eyes slowly and looked up at me with an honesty that almost hurt to see. "If staying with me stops feeling like your choice," he said quietly, "then it stops meaning anything good." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes because that was the first truly unselfish thing he had ever given me. Not money. Not protection. Freedom. And somehow that made me love him more than anything else ever had. By early March, Baltimore finally started thawing. Dirty snow disappeared from sidewalks in uneven patches, ferry horns sounded less lonely across the harbor, and the old laundromat next to the pharmacy no longer smelled entirely like mildew and abandonment. It smelled like fresh paint now, like drywall dust, like possibility. The federal investigation still had not disappeared. Some men from the docks had already been indicted. Others vanished quietly before subpoenas reached them. Callum spent more nights awake than asleep, and there were still moments when I caught him staring too long at the apartment window like he expected bad news to arrive eventually. Trauma did not vanish because somebody loved you correctly for a few months. But slowly and perfectly things changed anyway. Not through grand speeches. Through repetition. Through consistency. Through showing up again after difficult days instead of retreating behind silence every time fear appeared. One Thursday afternoon, I was balancing invoices at the pharmacy counter when Owen walked in carrying a crooked handmade sign wrapped in brown paper. "You ready?" he asked. "Absolutely not." He grinned. "Good. Means it matters." Across the street, workers were finishing installation on the new clinic entrance beside the pharmacy. Mercer Community Care. Nothing glamorous. 2 small exam rooms. Vaccination services. Basic screenings for dock workers without decent insurance. But it was ours. Mine. Built slowly with grants, loans, Owen's labor, and Callum quietly driving supply runs at 6 in the morning before harbor meetings because he still did not know how to help people halfway. Around 5 o'clock, the ribbon-cutting crowd finally dispersed. Local neighbors drifted home carrying grocery bags and paper cups of soup from the diner down the block. The sunset outside turned the harbor sky pale orange behind rows of brick buildings. I was locking the clinic door when I noticed Callum sitting alone on the curb near his truck. No expensive coat. No phone in his hand. Just exhausted silence and rolled sleeves dusted with drywall powder from helping install shelving all afternoon. I walked over slowly and handed him a bottled water. "You missed the mayor's speech." I heard enough politicians for one lifetime. I laughed softly before sitting beside him on the curb. For a while neither of us spoke. Traffic moved steadily through the intersection nearby. Somebody played old rock music from an apartment upstairs. Normal city sounds. The kind of ordinary life Callum once moved around like a visitor instead of part of it. "You know," I said eventually, 6 months ago I thought you were emotionally constipated." He looked mildly offended. 6 months ago? Okay, fair point. 4 months ago. A tired laugh escaped him quietly. Still rare. Still worth noticing every single time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me something small. The old blue plastic medicine box that once belonged to my mother. The one he rescued from storage months ago. I frowned slightly. "Why are you giving this back?" Callum rubbed his thumb once across the edge of the box before answering. Because I think I finally understand something. I waited quietly. He looked toward the clinic sign glowing softly under the evening lights. Helping somebody does not mean deciding everything for them. His voice stayed calm, but there was effort inside the words. Learned effort. Sometimes it just means staying long enough to carry things together. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not because the sentence sounded poetic. Because 6 months ago, Callum never would have been able to say it at all. I opened the medicine box slowly. Inside were my mother's old pharmacy receipts, apartment keys, faded photographs, and one folded piece of paper I had never seen before. Confused, I unfolded it carefully. It was the original contract from our marriage. Only now there was a line drawn through every legal clause in thick black ink. At the bottom, in Callum's rough handwriting, were 6 simple words. Your choice. Every day. I looked over at him so quickly my chest physically hurt. Callum immediately shifted, slightly uncomfortable under the attention. Like vulnerability still felt unnatural on him. I am not good at speeches, he muttered. Clearly. He rolled his eyes faintly while I laughed through sudden tears. Then, slowly, carefully, I rested my head against his shoulder for the first time without fear that one wrong movement would make him disappear emotionally again. Callum stayed perfectly still for half a second before relaxing beside me. Inch by inch, like trust was still something his body had to learn physically over time. Above us, the clinic lights glowed warm against the darkening Baltimore street, while ferry horns echoed softly across the harbor. And sitting there beside the man I once thought only understood contracts, power, and survival, I realized love had never changed him into somebody else. It had simply taught him that being needed was not the same thing as being chosen.